それではですね、時間になりましたので、始めさせていただきたいと思います。皆様、こんにちは。創立記念日おめでとうございます。本日はプログラム4、上智大学創立110年、大学創立と戦前期の歴史を振り返るにお越しいただき、誠にありがとうございます。私、本日司会を務めさせていただきます、国際教養学部の安野と申します。私、実は上智大学でお世話になってすでに20年以上になるんですけれども、歴史家ではございませんし、上智の卒業生でもありません。中学、高校は栄光学園の方を卒業しましたけれども、カトリック教徒ではありませんし、また大学の歴史についても最低限のことしか知りませんでした。ただ、妻が翻訳をやっておりまして、ここ2、3年、ソフィアアーカイブスの方からお仕事をいただいて、中井先生が現在中心になって編集されているソフィアアーカイブスブックレットの翻訳をしております。その行きがかり上、私もこのブックレットを読むことになったんですけれども、これがなかなか面白くてですね、大学の歴史について新しい興味深い事実が明らかになるというだけでなくてですね、大学を創立した神父さんたちが大学にどのような希望を託したのか、またどのような苦労をされたのか、そういったことがですね、自分としては初めて分かった、そういうふうに思いまして、上智の教職員の方々にも広く知っていただきたいな、というふうに思うようになりました。そこで、ソフィアアーカイブス、それから国際教養学部の教員の方々のご協力を得てですね、今回のプログラムを企画させていただいた次第です。何がそんなに面白かったのかということはですね、中井先生のご講演の後で少し追加でお話をさせていただきますけれども、まずは中井先生の方からご講演をいただきたいと思います。中井先生はですね、本学の名誉教授でいらっしゃいます。スタンフォード大学の方で学士号と修士号、そして1972年にハーバード大学で日本史の論文を書いて博士号を取得されました。その後、オレゴン大学を経て、1980年に本学に着任されました。以後、2010年に退職されるまで、30年にわたって本学で教鞭を取られたほか、1997年から2010年までは、本学で出しております国際的日本研究学術誌でありますモニュメンタ・ニポニカの編集長も務められました。ご専門は日本近世の思想史で、新井白石や水戸学、また近世近代の新唐史のご研究で有名でいらっしゃいますけれども、上智大学の歴史に関わる論文もお書きになっておりまして、先生が書かれた4冊目のソフィア・アーカイブス・ブックレットが来年出版の運びとなっております。それでは中井先生、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you, Professor Anno, for this kind introduction. And thank you above all for organizing this event on the occasion of the 110th anniversary of Sophia's founding, and for inviting me to take part in it. It is an honor to be asked to talk with you today about the university's early history. As Professor Anno mentioned, for some years now, I've been exploring various aspects of Sophia's history, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of the things that I found most striking in the course of those explorations. First, though, I'd like to say a little about the kind of resources that we have for investigating Sophia's history. Sophia's systematic investigation of Sophia's history began in the mid-1970s. It was led by two Jesuits, by Father Klaus Luhmer and Father Theodor Geppert. Both Father Luhmer and Father Geppert had been in Japan since before the war, and they had played a significant part in Sophia's rapid post-war growth. In 1977, Father Luhmer was appointed as the head of a committee that was given the task of documenting the history of Sophia University. This committee, in which Father Geppert also took on a central role, set about collecting a variety of materials concerning the university, beginning with the events leading up to the university's establishment in 1913. The materials collected by the committee included official documents submitted to the Ministry of Education, memos and records kept by the Jesuits at Sophia and at the Jesuit headquarters in Rome, newspaper articles, photographs, and so forth. From this collection, the committee selected items illustrating major developments in the university's history. And starting in 1980, Sophia School Corporation began to publish this selection of materials. Eventually, 6 volumes were published under the title Jochi Daigak Shiroshu, a collection of documents on the history of Sophia University. These 6 published volumes provide the starting point and a factual framework and foundation for exploring the university's history. Of course, the Shiroshu did not include all the pieces of evidence that the committee had gathered. So, together with the publication of the Shiroshu, in 1984, the university set up an office to preserve and build on this larger body of materials that the committee, headed by Father Loomer, had gathered as evidence about the university's history. This office was the Sophia Historical Records Room, which was allocated space on the 9th floor of the then new Central Library. 3 years ago, in 2020, the Sophia Historical Records Room was further expanded and reorganized into the present Sophia Archives. The Archives is responsible for preserving and cataloging all the various sorts of records that document the university's history. It also is the office in charge of making those records available to researchers. The Archives constantly adds new materials to its collection. Some of these materials are things that have been published, but many are unpublished records. This total body of materials kept by the Archives is the most fundamental source of evidence for investigating the university's history. Documents and evidence are the building blocks for any historical work, but to turn that evidence into an account that makes it possible to get a coherent sense of what happened and for what reason things happened as they did, someone has to analyze the documents and put the evidence in a broader context. Over the years, numerous people have done this, investigating and writing about different aspects of Sophia's overall history. Here, I would like to briefly mention 2 efforts of this kind with which I have had some connection. 10 years ago, to mark Sophia's 100th anniversary, Professor Sven Zahler of the Faculty of Liberal Arts organized an international symposium on Sophia's history. The symposium aimed to explore how Sophia's history was connected to larger educational, political, and social developments in the surrounding world. And it focused attention on a number of important issues deserving further research. Such issues include, for instance, how international events, such as the 2 world wars, affected Sophia's development, or what was the background and the impact of the decision to admit women to Sophia, which began in 1957. We should note here that up until that point, Sophia's student body was entirely male, which was true of many institutions of higher education worldwide and all Jesuit schools until the mid-20th century. So, in thinking about the project leading up to Sophia's founding, to which I'll turn in just a minute, we need to keep in mind that that project was intended to apply only to male students. As a follow-up to the 100th anniversary symposium, the Sophia Archives, as Professor Anno mentioned, in recent years has begun to publish a series of booklets. These investigate in greater depth the kinds of topics that the symposium identified as central to gaining a broad and well-grounded perspective on Sophia's history. The slide shows the 3 booklets that have been published up to now. The booklets, which are published in a dual language, English and Japanese format, are available both in print and digitally on the archive's website. The points that I would like to talk with you about today draw from these booklets. Since here I can only touch on what the booklets cover more fully, I hope that my remarks may whet your appetite for exploring what the booklets tell us about Sophia's early years. I'd like to focus the rest of my talk around a number of themes that seem to me to run through Sophia's early history. When we look at what Sophia is today, it's easy to assume that its history up to this point has followed a straight line. The Jesuits came, they founded a university, and here we are today. But it is not at all the case that the university's development unfolded in a straightforward, well-charted manner. When we look at the uncertainties that the first Jesuits faced and the challenges that they had to overcome, it seems almost miraculous that the seed they planted survived and ultimately came to flourish. To explore some aspects of this more complicated story, I'd like to focus, as I said, on several themes that I see as running through the history of how Sophia gradually took shape. I'll use 4 key words to sum up those themes. The first of those words is audacity, used in the positive sense of an intrepid boldness. Many aspects of how the Jesuits got started with their project in Japan are quite breathtaking when you stop to think about what was involved. As is well known, the formal process leading up to the founding of Sophia started with a request from Pope Pius X to the Society of Jesus in early fall 1906 to establish what was described as, quote, an institute of higher studies in Japan. The society accepted the request, and 2 years later, in 1908, the Jesuit Superior General dispatched 3 Jesuits to Japan to explore the situation and to make recommendations for how to go about the task of establishing this Institute of Higher Studies. What exactly was meant by Institute of Higher Studies was left undefined. It was sometimes described as a philosophical institute. A clear aim of sending the Jesuits to Japan and establishing the institute was to find a way for Catholicism to have a stronger presence in Japanese intellectual life and higher education than had been the case up until then. Church leaders were concerned that the Catholic Church had fallen behind Protestant organizations in these areas. From the end of the Tokugawa period on, Protestant missionaries had pursued educational activities as a way to win influential converts and supporters. Until the beginning of the 20th century, though, Catholic activities in Japan had been largely managed by the Paris Foreign Missions Society, and the missionaries of that order had put their efforts into other areas. The Paris Foreign Missions Society fathers emphasized charitable activities and direct proselytization rather than education, particularly rather than higher education. The task assigned the Jesuits was to bring a fresh approach, but the exact shape of that approach was something that the first group of Jesuits was supposed to figure out on the ground. The first group wrestled with this question for the next 4 years, with considerable debate and disagreement among themselves. And it was only at the beginning of 1913 that they at last decided definitely that the Institute of Higher Studies should take the concrete form of the university that opened its doors a couple of months later. When you think about it, audacious certainly seems the right word to describe the task the Jesuits set themselves. The initial 3 Jesuits sent to Japan were James Rockcliffe, Henri Boucher, and Joseph Dahlman. After a year and a half, Rockcliffe returned to the United States, and Herman Hoffman replaced him as the leader of the small group. None of this first group of Jesuits had prior knowledge of Japanese, and they knew very little about the country. The one with the most direct knowledge of Japan was Dahlman, who had spent a month in Japan in late 1903 as part of a study tour in India and China. The report that Dahlman subsequently submitted to Rome in 1905 and his recommendation that the Catholic Church should play a more active intellectual and educational role in Japan was a key impetus behind the Pope's decision to ask the Jesuits to lead that effort. Dahlman was a very keen and imaginative observer, but even so, he could hardly be said to be really familiar with Japan. At the time, there was only one native Japanese member of the Society of Jesus, Tsuchihashi Yachita. Tsuchihashi joined Hoffman and the others in Tokyo in the fall of 1911. But until that point, he had been outside Japan, in China and Europe, for 25 years. He had been converted to Catholicism as a youth, and after finishing elementary school, he entered the Catholic seminary in Tokyo. In 1886, he went on his own to China, where he studied with the French and Chinese Jesuits based in Shanghai. And eventually, he became a member of the society. The Jesuits sent him to Europe for a period of training and study, and after completing these studies, he returned to China and worked with the Jesuits there. So, of the Jesuits who founded Sophia, by 1913 there were 6. The only one fluent in Japanese was Tsuchihashi. The ones who came from Europe and the United States were all middle-aged when they arrived. Rawcliffe was 56 in 1908. Boucher was 51. Dahlman was 47. Hoffman was 44. To acquire more than a limited knowledge of Japanese at that age is an uphill struggle, as anyone who has tried will readily acknowledge. None of the founders, including Tsuchihashi, had any direct experience of secondary or higher education in Japan. Tsuchihashi must have found it easier than the others to grasp the institutional and social conditions that shaped Japanese education in the early 20th century. Nevertheless, those conditions had changed a great deal during the 25 years that he had been out of the country. This was particularly true in the area of higher education. Under these circumstances, it is not surprising that for the first several years, the Jesuits found it difficult to reach a conclusion about the shape their institute should take. That they ultimately came up with a specific plan and were able to carry it through owes quite a lot to the audacity of their conviction that this was both something they could do and something that they should do. A second key word is international. We can safely say that an international orientation was a defining characteristic of Sophia from the beginning. Yet, being international has different aspects to it, and the thrust or the content of what Sophia's being international meant changed over time. Here, I'd like to touch a little on some of these different dimensions of Sophia's international character. Sophia was international from the beginning, first of all, because of the diversity in the nationality and background of the founders. Rawcliffe was English by birth, but he had become a member of the German province of the Jesuits. The Society of Jesus is divided organizationally into geographic subunits that are called provinces. Rawcliffe had also spent much of his career in the United States. Boucher was French, but he had been based in China for many years, in the mission established there by the France province of the Jesuits. Dahlman and Hoffman were German, but some of their training had been in England. Tsuchihashi had been trained in France and England, as well as by the French and Chinese Jesuits in China. Two others who joined the initial group in 1911, Fritz Hillig and Victor Gettelmann, were German, but they had also received training in England and had been based in the United States before coming to Japan. As I'll touch on in a moment, Sophia would come to take on a strong German coloration. Nevertheless, the diverse national and linguistic background and experience of the founders definitely set Sophia apart from other Christian-affiliated schools in Japan. Other Christian-affiliated schools tended to be founded by missionary groups with a particular national base, primarily the United States. Another dimension of Sophia's international character was the larger political circumstances of the time and the Catholic Church's response to those circumstances. These factors bore quite directly on Sophia's founding. I believe that Professor Anno will say something more on this topic in his follow-up remarks, so I'll just briefly mention this point here. When Dahlmann made his report to Rome in June 1905, calling for the Church to take on a more active role in Japanese intellectual and educational life, one of the reasons he gave was that Japan was a rising power and was going to play a leadership role in Asia. From Dahlmann's perspective and from that of the Catholic Church, it was crucial to develop a channel for having an impact on Japan's coming generations of leaders, because Japan was going to have an impact on China and the rest of Asia. So Japan's rising international position and the Church's international interests were important factors behind the decision to send the Jesuits to Japan to establish an institute of higher studies. At the same time, for Sophia's first several decades, an international orientation clearly meant a Western orientation, not what we would call today a global one. Sophia's founders recognized that already much Western knowledge had been brought into Japan and was having a wide-ranging influence on Japanese intellectual life and society. Sophia's founders saw their mission as being to bring more authentic forms of Western knowledge to the table. As I've already emphasized, with the exception of Tsuchihashi, none of the founders were fluent in Japanese. They assumed that they would lecture in European languages, as was the case, for example, with the foreign professors at Tokyo Imperial University. They recognized the need to learn Japanese, and they envisioned a future when there would be Western Jesuits fluent in Japanese and also more Japanese Jesuits. But they saw that as something that lay quite a ways down the road. It was not an immediate prospect. Sophia's curriculum reflected these circumstances. The courses offered were almost totally Western in content, and this continued for a long time. Sophia's program initially was organized into two sections, one of which was philosophy and literature. This was the forerunner of today's Faculty of Humanities. Literature was defined specifically as German literature. Eventually, in 1941, a subsection on English literature was added, but it was not until 1959 that a subsection devoted to Japanese literature was added in the form of the Department of Japanese Literature. It's not that there was a complete absence of Japanese or non-Western content in a Sophia education. Individual courses on Kambun and on Chinese and Indian philosophy were taught from early on, but At Sophia, in the pre-war period, basically, students could expect to be immersed in a Western, or more particularly, a German environment. I'd like to introduce two slides that illustrate this. One is a printed form for students to keep track of their class schedule. This form must have been printed and distributed to the students for their own use. The particular example in this slide was used not by a student, but by one of the Jesuits, Fritz Hillig, who recorded his teaching schedule for 1916 on it. We have this example because Hillig preserved it in a set of albums that he later put together. Hillig's albums tell us many interesting things about Sophia's early years. And I'd like to mention that you can find out more about Hillig and these albums in the 4th Sophia Archives booklet that will be published soon. The key point here, though, is that students would have used the same form to keep track of their classes. And it tells us quite a lot about the school environment. As you can see, the form gives the university's name, Jochi Daigaku, in Japanese. But all the rest, from the heading class schedule, Stundenplan, to the names of the days of the week, is in German. A second image that illustrates the strong Western or German coloration of a Sophia education is a notebook in which a student who graduated in 1921 wrote down what Hoffman said in his class on the history of Western philosophy. The notebook, which the student later donated to the Sophia Archives, is a very valuable record of the actual content of some of the classes at Sophia in the early days. It lets us see both the topics covered and how Hoffman presented them. As you can see, the students' notes, like the lecture, are entirely in German. The page to the left, which is the first in the notebook, seems to show the students' original notes, taken down as Hoffman spoke. The page to the right is a clean copy of the first page. The notes start with European geography around 1500 and go on to discuss medieval philosophy. The creation of this kind of immersive environment had many positive aspects to it. In some ways, it might be seen as a kind of forerunner or a model for the international orientation that many feel should be introduced more thoroughly in Japanese higher education today. But at the same time, today, I think, we also would see an ideal international orientation as being more multidimensional and as involving more interaction with the Japanese setting and more Japanese input than this first model had. And indeed, in later years, Sophia education would move much more in this interactive direction. This brings me to a third key word, adaptability. As I've been emphasizing, the Jesuits came to Japan with only a limited understanding of the circumstances surrounding Japanese higher education in the first decade of the 20th century. They came also, as we've seen, with the assumption that they would be able to lecture on subjects that were their specialties, above all philosophy, in languages that they knew. They soon realized that things would not necessarily work that way. And so, as they debated the question of what the nature of their institute should be, little by little, they adapted themselves to the actual circumstances that they encountered. Again, this was not a straightforward, linear process. It had various zigs and zags. But gradually, the Jesuits adjusted their goals, or rather, they found new ways to reach those goals. This capacity to analyze the situation and to adapt to it was another crucial ingredient in the founders' ultimate success. Here, I'd like to touch on a couple of important dimensions of this process of adaptation. One issue that the Jesuits went back and forth about among themselves in the first few years was how to situate themselves relative to the system of education already existing in Japan. Should they establish their institute as a kind of independent entity outside the officially sanctioned educational system? Or should they try to be part of that system? If they chose to operate within the system, they would have to submit to government regulation, and their program would have to adhere to various requirements and restrictions set by the state. If they stayed outside the system, on the other hand, they would be free to design their program as they wanted. But staying outside the system would also mean that they would have to depend solely on the power of their knowledge and their personal intellectual aura to attract the audience that they wanted to reach. The Jesuits were confident about the power of their knowledge, but they also came to recognize a reality that had become a basic aspect of the Japanese educational environment by the beginning of the 20th century. To attract students, it was essential to be able to offer credentials like a graduation degree and privileges like the deferment of military service that came only with government accreditation. If the Jesuits wanted to reach an audience of talented and ambitious young men and thereby play a part in shaping Japan's course henceforth, they would have to accommodate themselves to this reality and seek government accreditation for their program. Going back to a point that I touched on a little earlier, this accommodation was, in a sense, another side of the Jesuits recognizing Japan's status as a rising world power. That status owed much to Japan's success in building national institutional structures, one of which was education. By opting to fit their enterprise into the existing Japanese educational framework, the Jesuits also acknowledged what that framework had accomplished and the need to work with it. As the Jesuits gradually came to conclude that they should seek government accreditation, another issue arose. At what educational level should they start? In many ways, the level closest to the type of school that the Jesuits operated most commonly elsewhere, and thus were most familiar with, was the middle school. In Japan, in the pre-war period, the middle school, which was an institution only for male students, covered up through what today would be considered high school. Completion of middle school provided the basic qualification for admission to all forms of higher education, apart from the imperial universities. For the imperial universities, but only those, one had to complete an additional preparatory level, the pre-war higher school. The Jesuits gave thought to starting with the middle school, but they concluded quite quickly that trying to begin with the middle school would have too many negative aspects. For one, the government regulated the middle school curriculum quite strictly, and the first Jesuits and the Jesuit leadership in Rome felt that these regulations would overly constrain their freedom to develop a program in accordance with their own ideas. Another obstacle was that almost all the teaching would have to be in Japanese, and the first Jesuits were not prepared to undertake this. So the first group of Jesuits set aside the idea of starting with a middle school. We should keep in mind, however, that although they set the idea aside, they did not abandon it. A middle school remained a long-range goal. The Jesuits succeeded in realizing this goal in 1938 with the opening of Rokko Gakuin in Kobe. This was followed after the war with the founding of Eiko Gakuen in 1947 and Hiroshima Gakuin in 1956. If not a middle school, then what would be both feasible and a step toward establishing an institute of higher studies? Their debates over this issue led the Jesuits increasingly toward an emphasis on language education. There were two good reasons for this. For one, they came to realize that if they were to present their academic specialties in a Western language, their prospective students would need previous training in that language. Second, the Jesuits saw that foreign language education was a major draw at all the Christian affiliated schools where foreign missionaries made up a significant part of the teaching staff. These considerations led the Jesuits to think of a program along the lines of the higher school. As I touched on, higher schools basically served the imperial universities as a preparatory stage. And for that purpose, they also heavily emphasized foreign language training. At this time, the foreign schools were all government institutions, but much debate was going on inside and outside the government about the place of the higher school within the overall national educational system. And the Jesuits evidently concluded that there might be a place for their program in this area. A further question was, what language to emphasize? Initially, the Jesuits thought that they should give priority to English, which then, as now, was the foreign language most widely in demand in Japan. But they realized, with Rockcliffe having returned to the United States, none of them was a native English speaker or had experience in English language education. Would presenting themselves as authorities on this subject really be an effective strategy? No, they concluded. So they decided to put their primary emphasis on German with a secondary emphasis on English. In late 1912, Hoffman approached the Ministry of Education with a proposal for a 3-year program that looked very much like that of the higher schools. It consisted largely of language classes in German and English, with a few additional general education courses. The ministry's response was not very positive. The official whom Hoffman consulted pointed out that the category of higher school was reserved for state institutions. He also told the Jesuits that their proposed program did not have enough specialized content beyond the general education level to qualify as a specialized school, a senmongakko. Senmongakko was the category applied to all institutions of higher education, apart from the imperial universities and the government higher schools. It had a very different meaning at the time than it does today. All major private institutions of higher education, including Keio and Waseda, and state schools other than the imperial universities, like today's Hitotsubashi, were categorized as senmongakko. The Jesuits thus rethought their program and resubmitted it for approval in mid-March 1913. This time, they proposed a program with 2 divisions or stages, a 2-year preparatory division, yoka, and a 3-year main division, honka. In effect, the Jesuits converted their previous proposed program into the preparatory division, which continued to emphasize language training. Students were to take 17 to 18 hours a week of German and 6 hours of English. The remaining 6 to 8 hours were allocated to general education and skills courses. The main division had 2 academic sections, each of which taught its own specialized content. The slide, which reproduces the application that the Jesuits submitted for approval, shows the structure. You can see that there were 2 divisions, the yoka, the preparatory division, and the honka, the main division. Each division had 2 sections. One was bunka, or humanities, which was divided into philosophy and German literature. And the other was commerce, shoka. As the slide also shows, the Jesuits set the anticipated overall size of the student body at 500 students, with 100 to be admitted each year. In fact, in the pre-war period, Sophia never came close to reaching this number. The humanities, or philosophy and German literature section of the main division consisted of courses that the Jesuits would teach in German. As you can see from the students' notes in German that we looked at above, he was enrolled in the philosophy section. In this regard, and in its content, the humanities section was in line with what the Jesuits had planned to focus on from the beginning. The second section was something quite different. The second section, as you can see, was commerce. Commerce was a last-minute addition. The correspondence between the Jesuits in Tokyo and the Jesuit headquarters in Rome makes no mention up to this point of the possibility of a program in commerce. And establishing one was a real leap for the Jesuits. They knew that they personally would be able to teach very few of the courses in the commerce section. They would have to depend on adjunct faculty teaching in Japanese, covering the salaries of those adjunct professors would be a major expenditure for the university in the following years. Consequently, for many years thereafter, finding Jesuits who could come to Japan to teach in the commerce section would remain a key priority. But even so, there were good reasons for the Jesuits to take on the challenge of starting a program in commerce. By 1913, they recognized that they would not be able to attract enough students interested in studying philosophy and literature to sustain their school. And commerce was the drawing card of the day in Japanese higher education. It was the equivalent of today's IT or global studies program, reflecting the growth of a modern white-collar economy. Commerce programs were expanding rapidly throughout Japan just at this time, in terms both of the numbers of schools adding such programs and the numbers of students enrolling in them. Between 1905 and 1915, the number of students graduating from commerce programs at institutions of higher education nationwide expanded 6 times. By 1915, commerce was the most popular major in Japan, outstripping medicine, engineering, and law. So, the Jesuits' recognition of this situation and their decision to add a commerce section is a good illustration of their ability to adjust themselves to the circumstances they encountered. That adaptability was surely an important factor in their success. Time is growing short, and so I can only touch briefly on a fourth keyword: resilience. At the end of March 1913, the Ministry of Education granted approval for the program that we've just described, and Sophia University opened its doors the next month. But the Jesuits and their new university were hardly home free. The following decades brought a series of major challenges and crises, virtually one every decade. Resilience in the face of adversity was thus a very important factor in the university's history. It was crucial to the ability of the first Jesuits and their immediate successors to steer the new school to the point where it could develop steadily and become the university that we see around us today. Since I can't go into all the challenges and crises that the Jesuits faced in Sophia's first decades, I'd like to close by mentioning just one, the story of the university's first major building project. The university's first building project was the so-called red brick building, or akarenga. Even before the Jesuits had decided what exact shape their program should take, they had begun to make plans for an impressive Western-style classroom and administration building. They saw the construction of such a building as vital to demonstrating the seriousness of their commitment and to attracting the attention of prospective students. Fritz Hillig, the Jesuit whose class schedule we saw earlier, was the one who came up with the idea for the building's design. An architect named Jan Letzel, who had designed various buildings in Tokyo, then translated Hillig's idea into structural building plans. Construction on akarenga began in the fall of 1913, and it was ready to be used by the fall semester of 1914. Hillig drew inspiration for the design of akarenga from the design of Stonyhurst, a famous Jesuit school in England, which Hillig had seen while he was studying in England. The resemblance between the finished akarenga and Stonyhurst may not seem so immediately apparent, but akarenga as constructed was supposed to be only half of the eventual ultimate building. Hillig envisioned that another wing would be added as the school grew. To communicate their plans for the new university and show its attractions, the Jesuits put a sketch of akarenga's design in the flyer that announced Sophia's opening and called for applicants. The sketch shows both the wing to be constructed immediately, the wing to the right, and the wing to be constructed as the second stage, the wing to the left. This plan for the eventual full akarenga shows much more clearly the resemblance to Stonyhurst. Akarenga thus symbolized several things. It was a tangible link to the Jesuit heritage and ideals. It expressed the firmness of the Jesuits' commitment to building an institution of higher learning in Japan, and it pointed to their hopes for Sophia's future growth. But akarenga also symbolizes the trials the university had to go through to reach that future. Less than 10 years after it had been completed, akarenga was badly damaged in the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake. So badly damaged that the top 2 stories had to be torn down. A provisional wooden second floor was put up in their place. The university lost not only the proud symbol of its existence, but a major investment. 9 years later, in 1932, after overcoming other major challenges, the Jesuits succeeded in erecting a new classroom and administration building next to the sadly damaged Akarenga. You can just see Akarenga at the rear, behind the new building. This new building, which we know today as building number 1, was constructed to be earthquake-proof, and it continues to stand at the center of the campus today. It is one of our main physical connections to Sophia's history. But today, as we celebrate Sophia's 110th anniversary, I hope we will also remember Akarenga, the university's lost original first building. And in remembering Akarenga, let us recall also Sophia's founders' hopes, the challenges they encountered, and the determination and resilience with which they overcame those challenges. Thank you very much.
中井先生、素晴らしいご講演をいただきありがとうございました。皆様いかがでしたでしょうか。この赤レンガ校舎を設計したヤン・レツルさんという建築家の方なんですけれども、ご存知の方もいらっしゃるかと思いますけれども、広島県物産陳列館、つまり後の原爆ドームを設計されたことで知られています。チェコ出身の方で、1906年に来日され、建築家として大いに活躍されましたけれども、関東大震災の結果、設計された建物の多くが被災することになり、またご自身も財産を失われたこともあり、1923年11月に帰国され、2年後の1925年にわずか45歳で亡くなっています。赤レンガ校舎が倒壊したことは上智大学にとって大きな試練であったわけですけれども、レツルさんにとってもとても辛いことであったのではないでしょうか。さて、私にとってブックレットの何が一番面白かったのかというお話をいたしますけれども、上智大学の創立に至る国際環境というのが最も面白かった点でした。上智大学の創立については、聖フランシスコ・ザビエルの日本の都に大学を設立したいという希望があり、それが350年の時を経て実現したというふうによく言われるわけですけれども、なぜ1913年だったのかということは私には最近まで分かりませんでした。キリスト教禁教令は1873年にすでに廃止されていて、その後、明治学院、立教、青山学院といったプロテスタント系の学校が早い段階で設立されていたのに、なぜ上智の創立は1913年を待たねばならなかったのか。ブックレットを読んでですね、これは実は日露戦争が上智の創立の大きなきっかけとなっており、1913年というタイミングもそれで説明がつくのではないかということが分かってまいりました。中井先生が触れられました通り、日本の開国当初からカトリックの日本での布教はパリ外国宣教会が担当することが決まっていました。その結果、明治の日本ではカトリックはフランスと結びつけて考えられるようになっていました。そうした中で、日露戦争は2つの意味でカトリック教会にとって難しい事態をもたらしました。一つには、フランスが1890年代以来、ロシアの最も近しい同盟国となっていたため、日露戦争が起こった時には、日本で対仏感情が悪化し、その煽りでフランスの宗教と見られがちだったカトリック教会も難しい立場に置かれることになったわけです。もう一つは、日本が日露戦争に勝ってしまった。 その結果、アジア諸国に対する日本の影響が飛躍的に大きくなるということが予測された。その日本でカトリック教会に対する感情が悪ければ、日本はもちろん、アジア全域での布教においてカトリック教会は遅れを取ってしまうのではないか。こうした考えがカトリック教会の指導部に、日本で新たな活動を始める決意をさせたのではないか。そういうふうに考えられるわけです。その際に大きな役割を果たしたのがヨゼフ・ダールマン氏でした。ダールマン神父は1903年の末に1月ほど日本に滞在する機会を持ちました。明治以降、日本に足を踏み入れて記録を残したイエズス会士は彼が初めてでした。その経験に基づいてダールマン神父はローマのイエズス会本部に向けて、カトリック教会が日本でより大きな役割を果たし得ること、ただしそのためには新しいアプローチ、つまり高等教育を重視したアプローチが必要であることを主張しました。また、イギリス人やアメリカ人、そしてドイツ人の宣教師を派遣することで、日本の知識界にあった最先進国はプロテスタントという固定観念を打ち破り、カトリックの占める地位を高めるべきだという提案をします。ダールマン氏は日本を離れてから上海、インドのダージリン、スリランカのキャンディなどを経て、1905年6月22日にローマに帰着しますが、7月の3日には異例ともいえる教皇ピオ10世との私的謁見を許されています。この謁見の際にですね、ダールマン氏が中国について話し始めると、教皇は、あなたは日本にも行ったのでしょうと言われ、ダールマン氏が肯定すると、ではあなたは日本にお戻りなさいとおっしゃった。続けてイエズス会に日本での新たな事業を引き受けてほしい。イエズス会は日本に高等学術機関を設立せねばなりません。こういうふうに言われて、それが中井先生も触れられた教皇からイエズス会に対する1906年の正式な要請へとつながっていったわけです。で、このダールマン氏とピオ10世の謁見のタイミングというのが絶妙でありまして、日本がですね、この日露戦争を有利な形で終結に持ち込むことができたのは、日本海海戦の勝利による部分が大きいわけですけれども、この日本海海戦というのは1905年の5月27日、28日に戦われてですね、その結果が欧米で報じられて大きな衝撃をもたらしたのは5月30日のことでした。5月30日にはダールマン氏はまだスリランカにいましたけれども、すぐにコロンボから船に乗り、ナポリに帰宅したのは6月の20日でした。その間、6月12日にはですね、6月12日には、日露両国がセオドア・ローズベルト大統領の講和提案を受け入れて、講和会議が開催される見通しになっていました。ダールマン氏はローマに6月22日に到着しますと、日本における教会の使命という長文の報告書を書いて、教皇庁国務長官であったメリー・デルバル枢機卿に提出いたします。そして、教皇との面会が実現したのが7月の3日であります。この会見で教皇が日本での布教活動に力を入れる決意を見せた背景には、やはりこの日露戦争の動向、特に日本海海戦の結果というものがあったのではないかなと、推測したくなるわけであります。で、7月の22日になりますと、このメリー・デルバル教皇庁国務長官がですね、アメリカ・メーン州ポートランドの司教であったウィリアム・ヘンリー・オコンネル神父を教皇の特使として日本に派遣するという決定をしていますけれども、それに先立つ7月の13日にはですね、日露の講和会議がニューハンプシャー州のポーツマスで行われるということが報道されていました。オコンネル司教はですね、メリー・デルバル枢機卿と親しかったために特使に選ばれたという説もありますけれども、オコンネル司教のいらしたポートランドというところは、ポーツマスからわずか80キロほどの距離にあります。日本にとってこの戦争の結末がアメリカの仲介にかかっている、こういう状況で、バチカンがアメリカ人の司教を選んで教皇特使として日本に派遣した背景には、カトリック教会に対する良好な対応を日本から引き出そうという教皇庁の意図が感じられるのではないでしょうか。 ともかく一つ推測できるのは、日露戦争に伴う日本における対仏感情の悪化と日本の国際的地位の向上が教皇庁を動かして新たな日本での事業を決意させたのではないかということです。で、こういうふうに考えてみますとですね、上智大学の設立という出来事が単に私たちの大学の歴史というだけではなくて、日本史の流れ、ひいては世界史の大きな流れの中でですね、一定の意義を持つ出来事として、新しく見えてくるのではないかな、そういうふうに思います。その点がですね、私がブックレットで一番面白いな、思った点でありました。もう一つ言えるのはですね、教皇庁、そしてイエズス会が日本での新たな事業に動き出した理由は、単に日本でカトリック教会の影響力を確保するということだけではなくて、アジア全域においてカトリック教会の影響を強めたいと考えたためだったということです。ダールマン神父は、日本は東アジアの先生になるんだというふうに述べて、カトリックの布教における日本の重要性を繰り返し強調していました。また1929年になりますけれども、教皇ピオ11世は、上智大学が広大なアジアに救いの光をあまねく照らす灯台になるようにという願いを大学関係者に伝えています。つまり、バチカンの希望としては、日本がアジアで影響力を強めることを通じて、カトリックの教えがアジア全体で影響力を増すということを期待していたわけです。ご承知の通り、その後日本は中国や東南アジアを軍事力で支配しようとして戦争に敗れ、日本が東アジアの先生になるというダールマン氏の見込みは外れた形になりました。しかし、上智大学は日本だけではなく、広大なアジアをあまねく照らす灯台になるという大きな希望を持って設立された。そういうことはですね、私たち上智大学の教職員が知っておいても良いことではないかなというふうに私は感じております。私から申し上げることは以上です。
ここからは質疑応答となりますが、質疑応答については、当日の質疑応答をベースに編集再構成した字幕版でお届けいたします。
もう時間をですね、すでに10分ほど過ぎておりますので、この辺で質疑応答を終わらせていただきたいと思うんですけれども、続きましてですね、中井先生、ちょっとその場にいらしていただけますでしょうか。ご講演をいただき、また、上智の歴史の研究に、大きな役割を果たされています中井先生にここで花束を贈呈したいと思います。国際教養学部のクリスチャン・ヘス先生、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。ありがとうございました。お座りいただいて結構です。ここで皆様にソフィアアーカイブスとブックレットのご案内をさせていただきます。ブックレットの方は申しましたように英日大訳でこれまで3冊出ておりまして、4冊目が来年早々刊行予定となっております。で、ブックレットはオンラインでですね、お読みいただけるんですけれども、リンクの QR コードが載っておりますので、そちらをご参照いただきたいと思います。3冊出ておりますけれども、一番最初に読む際には、クラウス・シャッツ神父による上智大学の設立というブックレットが一番とっつきやすいのではないかなということを申し添えておきます。以上をもちまして本日のプログラムは終了とさせていただきます。皆様本当にご参加いただきどうもありがとうございました。改めまして創立記念日おめでとうございます。